This is the first video of my four-part series on theme. Now, before I begin, I want to explain a little about the title of this series of videos that I call Write with the Clarity of a Photo. You've heard the saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. If you haven't or have but not sure what it means, simply put, what you see in a single picture could take 1,000 words to describe. In a single picture, such as two mothers sitting on a bench while their daughters play house on a blanket a couple of feet from them, says a lot to the one viewing it. In a moment's glance, the viewer can get a pretty good idea of what's going on. But if you're a writer without that picture to show to your readers, it's incumbent on you to be able to describe the scene with your creative use of words. Now, usually I use several images to help make my point, but since I want you to be able to concentrate and envision the narration, while I will be talking about narration and dialogue, I will keep the images to a bare minimum. Back to our picture scenario. You might not need to use the entire 1,000 words to get your point across, but you might write something like this. With the sound of birds chirping, dogs barking, and children playing, two women in their mid-20s sit on one of several park benches discussing their usual topic of discussion, the latest episode of their favorite soap opera. The sun quite effectively blanketed the entire park with its warm presence. "That's not fair," said little Angela. She was upset at getting the chipped teacup 2 days in a row. "I had to use the broken cup last time." Rachel secretly smiled, glad that she got the good set of cups again. It was at that moment a small dog, followed by a little boy, raced past them, knocking over the girls' tea party set on their way to the sandpit. "Mom," cried Rachel, "Tommy and Booster messed up our tea party." Kathy turned and looked over her shoulder at the girls next to them on a blanket on the grass. She then looked beyond them and watched Tommy and his dog running in a playful way. She watched the two as the little boy jumped over a ball kicked by a young man on its way to his son. "It's okay, honey. They're gone now. Finish having your tea." I could have continued for another 1,000 words, giving the reader a more exact representation of the scene, but I have done what I set out to do with my description of the scene. And that has been to let you see how well theme, narration, and dialogue work together. If you're still not quite sure what I mean, by the time we reach the end of these series, I'm confident you will be. Time for another of my little tales. A man by the name of Wolfgang is caught hanging around a train yard. The authorities have been watching him for the past several weeks because they had received a tip that he was about to, once again, transport an incredibly large amount of gold across the border. Over the years, he has successfully found a way to transport one shipment after another and was never caught. Everyone knew what he was doing. The authorities on both sides of the border knew that his favorite method for taking the gold across the border was by train. The problem was, although everybody knew the way he got it over the border, no one could figure out how he was able to accomplish this near impossible task. He had made fools out of the authorities far too many times, and they wanted to catch him in the act more than anything else. They just couldn't figure out how he was doing it. But this time, Lieutenant Rutger wasn't taking any chances, and when the reports of a large amount of gold had been stolen, he knew that Wolfgang was behind the robbery. And he knew that his next act would be to get it across the border to his country. Lieutenant Rutger also found out that Wolfgang was finally retiring, and this was to be his last job, knowing that if he didn't catch him this time, he never would have the opportunity again. Lieutenant Rutger enlisted the aid of several hundred men to ensure his chances of finally capturing this elusive thief. Because this was to be Wolfgang's last and final job, he made sure that it would be the largest he had ever attempted before. When the gold reserve opened up on Monday morning and found that a large amount of its gold had been removed, the entire city was on alert for Wolfgang, who was the only thief capable of pulling off such a large heist. Lieutenant Rutger believed that Wolfgang's vanity and need to prove he could pull off such a huge amount of gold would be his undoing. In the past, Wolfgang had been satisfied with stealing and then transporting small amounts of gold, easily hidden on some unsuspecting train, and then somehow retrieving that gold once it crossed the border. But this was such an enormous amount of gold that it would be impossible for him to smuggle it across the border on a train without being caught. Lieutenant Rutger had spent the last week patrolling the border where all trains must pass. It was during a night while he and his men were routinely searching through each train before it crossed that he realized that Wolfgang was far too smart to put all of his stolen gold onto one train. From that moment, he believed that the gold had been placed on several different trains in very inconspicuous areas. He then had his men search every conceivable area of each train, but found nothing. He thought some more and with a smile realized exactly how Wolfgang had intended to transport the gold. On the following Sunday, 3 weeks after Wolfgang had robbed the gold reserve, the lieutenant had ordered all trains to be prevented from crossing the border. The last and final train that was set to cross the border would be Wolfgang's last chance to transport all of that gold to his country. Lieutenant Rutger knew that would be the train that Wolfgang would use because it was the largest train in the fleet, and because the president would be traveling on it, the law prevents it from being searched. But the lieutenant had earlier received permission to search the train, and when it arrived at the border, ready to cross, it was boarded and searched by all hundreds and hundreds of the lieutenant's men. After 3 full days and nights of diligently searching every part of the train, they finally had to allow the train to cross the border. A week later, Lieutenant Rutger received a letter from Wolfgang letting him know that he got the gold across the border. Today, I'll talk about why the theme of your story is so important to your story, and then I'll tell you how Wolfgang was able to get all of that gold across the border. I'm going to begin talking about theme and why it's so vital to your novel. You might now be asking yourself, what is theme and how is it integrated into a story? As much as I would like to hand you the quick answer and leave you with a total understanding of just what theme is, I can't. And that's simply because, unlike the plot of your novel or the character you are writing about, theme is more of an underlying entity that runs throughout your story. I'm sure that has done nothing more than confuse you further, so I'll explain it in a few easier to understand ways. Theme is just that, a theme. Let's say back when you were a child, you had a friend who was obsessed with Spider-Man, or a friend who was infatuated with everything to do with Barbie. Then one afternoon, you were invited to your friend's birthday party. Now, the subject of the party remained a birthday party, but the underlying theme, the atmosphere, the mood, the tone, feeling, was your friend's hero. You've heard of theme parks. Disney is famous for their theme parks. The Harry Potter theme park, for instance, would be infused with countless reminders of the popular series. A Harry Potter roller coaster ride, streets made to resemble the streets from the story, even a cafeteria or restaurant that allows all who attend the feeling of being in the story. The subject remains Harry Potter, but the theme is the opinion expressed on the subject. In literary works, such as the novel you are preparing to write, theme is often the moral of the story or the overall message. The textbook definition is a universal idea, lesson, or message explored throughout a work of literature reflecting broader truths about human experiences. Let's examine for a moment the moral of the story. Remember back in school when your teacher gave your class a story to read and then asked you to describe the moral of that story. All your teacher was trying to get you to understand was the lesson the main character learns, the lesson you learned. Remember the story of the boy who cried wolf? If you remember from one of my earlier videos, I talked about this well-known story. If you missed that video or never had the opportunity to read it, it's about a shepherd boy who continually fools the local villagers into believing he has seen a wolf. Each time the villagers rush out in the attempt to kill the wolf, but because it was just a made-up story brought about by boredom, they can find no wolf. But when the boy finally does see a wolf, the villagers have already stopped believing his words and therefore take no action. Subsequently, the wolf kills the sheep. Here, the moral of the story might be, no one believes a liar even when they speak the truth. How about that old story of the tortoise and the hare? If you don't remember this one, it's about a tortoise and a hare in a race. I covered this story in a previous video also. If you missed it or have never read the story, it's called, obviously enough, The Tortoise and the Hare. Now, everyone knows that a hare is much faster than a tortoise and therefore doesn't make for a proper competition. But for some, like the hare, confidence breeds arrogance, leaving a person with a sort of godlike complex. In the case of the hare, knowing he could easily outrun the tortoise, he didn't take the race seriously enough and halfway through the race decides to take a nap. The tortoise, however, did take the race seriously and slowly he continued on to the finish line without stopping. By the time the hare woke up, the race was over and the tortoise had won. And the moral of this story might be, slow and steady wins the race. Or, one's own ego is one's own undoing. In both examples, the moral teaches us, the reader, something about the main character and about life. And that's what the theme is. In the first example about the shepherd boy who, out of boredom, lied to get attention, the overall theme, the atmosphere, the mood, the tone, feeling is allowing us to see that lying isn't good and it may serve to eventually hurt us. In the second example, the overall theme teaches us about dedication, commitment, perseverance, and so on. It's important to understand that these two examples that I've given you are both Aesop fables and intended to leave the reader with a strong and lasting lesson or message. This isn't necessarily the case in most literary works, and it probably won't be the case in the novel you are preparing to write. In my next video, part 2 of this series on theme, titled The Major and the Minor, I'll talk about these two types of theme. And now, I'll tell you the ending to the story I call In Plain Sight. With all of Lieutenant Rutger's efforts, even though everybody knew that Wolfgang would at some point transport all that gold across the border, he just couldn't figure out how he would do it. But Wolfgang was quite smart, and he always planned far ahead. That's why he had gone so long without being caught. In his previous crossings, he would normally hide his gold on different trains, but because this was such a huge amount of gold and not easily hidden, as well as the fact that Lieutenant Rutger was relentless in his search, he did what no one could even imagine. While the president of his country was visiting, he took possession of that train and replaced it with another that looked identical in every way. Then he waited for it to be searched and allowed to cross the border. And the reason why Lieutenant Rutger and his hundreds of men couldn't find any of the gold was because they concentrated their efforts to the inside of the train. They should have been looking at the train itself. If they had, they would have realized that under that colorful paint job, the entire exterior of the train was made out of gold. Thanks for watching, and if you found anything that I said beneficial to you in any way, hit that subscribe button because you never know. My next video might just be helpful too.
No se detiene, la música niega, la música nos envuelve, nos mantiene, vamos todos a disfrutar.